This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marloes Schoonheim. History of Holland by George Edmundson. Chapter 6. The Beginnings of the Dutch Republic. At the moment of the assassination of William the Silent, it might well have seemed to an impartial observer that the restoration of the authority of the Spanish king over the whole of the Netherlands was only a question of time. The military skill and the statecraft of Alexander Farnese were making slow but sure progress in the reconquest of Flanders and Brabant. Despite the miserable inadequacy of the financial support he received from Spain, the Governor-General, at the head of a numerically small but thoroughly efficient and well-disciplined army, was capturing town after town. In 1583 Dunkirk, Nieuwpoort, Lindhoven, Steenbergen, Zutphen and Sas van Gent fell. In the spring of 1584 Ypres and Brugge were already in Spanish hands. And on the very day of William's death the fort of Liefkenshoek on the Scheldt, one of the outlying defences of Antwerp, was taken by assault. In August Dendermonde, in September Ghent surrendered. All West Flanders, except the seaports of Ostend and Sluis, had in the early autumn of 1584 been reduced to the obedience of the king. The campaign of the following year was to be even more successful. Brussels, the seat of government, was compelled by starvation to capitulate March 10. Mechlin was taken July 19. And finally Antwerp, after a memorable siege in which Parma displayed masterful skill and resource, passed once more into the possession of the Spaniards. The fall of this great town was a very heavy blow to the patriot cause, and it was likewise the ruin of Antwerp itself. A very large part of its most enterprising inhabitants left their homes rather than abjure their religious faith and took refuge in Holland and Zeeland, or fled across the Rhine into Germany. Access to the sea down the Scheldt was closed by the fleets of the sea beggars, and the commerce and industry of the first commercial port of Western Europe passed to Amsterdam and Middelburg. Meanwhile there had been no sign of weakness or of yielding on the part of the sturdy burghers of Holland and Zeeland. On the fatal July 10, 1584, the Estates of Holland were in session at Delft. They at once took energetic action under the able leadership of Paul Buys, advocate of Holland, and John van Alden Barnavelt, pensionary of Rotterdam. They passed a resolution to uphold the good cause with God's help without sparing gold or blood. Dispatches were at once sent to the estates of the other provinces, to the town councils and to the military and naval commanders, affirming their own determined attitude and exhorting all those who had accepted the leadership of the murdered Prince of Orange to bear themselves manfully and piously without abatement of zeal on account of the aforesaid misfortune. Their calm courage at such a moment of crisis restored men's minds. There was no panic. Steps were at once taken for carrying on the government in Holland, Zeeland and Utrecht. Stimulated by the example of Holland, the States General likewise took prompt action. On August 18, a Council of State was appointed to exercise provisionally the executive powers of sovereignty, consisting of 18 members, 4 from Holland, 3 each from Zeeland and Friesland, 2 from Utrecht and 6 from Brabant and Flanders. Of this body, Maurice of Nassau, William's 17-year-old son, was nominated first councillor, and a pension of 30,000 guilders per annum was granted him. At the same time, Louise de Coligny was invited to take up her residence in Holland, and suitable provision was made for her. William Lewis, son of Count John of Nassau, was elected stadtholder of Friesland. Count Nieuwenaar was stadtholder of Gelderland and shortly afterwards also of Utrecht and Overijssel. Owing to the youth of Maurice, the question as to whether he should become Count of Holland and Zeeland or to be elected stadtholder was left in abeyance until it should be settled to which of 2 foreign rulers the sovereignty of the provinces, now that Anjou was dead, should be offered. In the revolted provinces the responsible leaders were at this time practically unanimous in their opinion that any attempt on their part to carry on the struggle against the power of Spain without foreign assistance was hopeless, and it was held that such assistance could only be obtained by following in the footsteps of William and offering to confer the overlordship of the provinces on another sovereign in the place of Philip II. There were but 2 possible candidates, Henry III of France and Elizabeth of England. There were objections to both, but the rapid successes of Parma made it necessary to take action. The partisans of a French alliance were in the majority, despite the efforts of a strong opposition headed by Paul Buys, and an embassy, January 1585, was dispatched to Paris to offer conditionally to the French king the protectorship of Holland and Zeeland and sovereignty over the other provinces. The negotiations went on for a couple of months, but Henry III finally declined the offer. Another embassy was sent July 1585 to England, but Elizabeth refused absolutely to accept the sovereignty. She, however, was not averse to the proposal that she should dispatch a body of troops to the armed assistance of the provinces, provided that adequate guarantees were given for the outlay. She was afraid of Philip II, and, though she had no love for men who were rebels to their lawful sovereign, was quite willing to use them for her own ends. Her motives, therefore, were mixed and purely self-interested. Nevertheless, it is doubtful if the negotiations would have led to any definite result had not the news of the fall of Antwerp made both parties feel that this was no time for haggling or procrastination. Elizabeth therefore promised to send at once 6,000 troops under the command of a gentleman of quality who should bear the title of Governor-General. He was to co-operate with the Council of State, on which 2 Englishmen were to sit, in restoring order and in maintaining and defending the ancient rights and privileges of the provinces. The Governor-General and all other officials were to take an oath of fealty both to the States-General and to the Queen. The towns of Flushing and Brill, with the fort of Rammekens, were to be handed over in pledge to Elizabeth for the repayment of expenses and received English garrisons. They were known as the cautionary towns. At the end of October, the States were informed that the choice of the Queen had fallen upon a favourite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and that he would shortly set out for the Netherlands. Holland and Zeeland, ever jealous of foreign interference with their rights and privileges, resolved now to forestall the arrival of the English Governor-General by appointing Maurice of Nassau, with the title of Excellency, to the offices of Stadtholder and Admiral and Captain-General of both provinces, and the Count of Hohenlohe was nominated, Maurice being still little more than a boy, to the actual command of the States' forces. Leicester set sail from Harwich accompanied by a fleet of 50 vessels and landed at Flushing on December 19. He met everywhere with an enthusiastic reception. The States General were eager to confer large powers upon him. Practically, he was invested with the same authority as the former regent, Mary of Hungary, with the reservation that the States General and the provincial estates should meet at their own instance, that the present stadtholders should continue in office, and that appointments to vacant offices should be made from 2 or 3 persons nominated by the provincial estates. A new Council of State was created which, as previously agreed, included 2 Englishmen. On February 4, 1586, Leicester's government was solemnly inaugurated in the presence of Maurice of Nassau and the States General, and he accepted the title of Excellency. Elizabeth, on hearing this, was very angry and even threatened to recall Leicester, and she sent Lord Heneage to express both to the States General and the Governor-General her grave displeasure at what had taken place. She bade Leicester restrict himself to the functions that she had assigned to him, and it was not until July that she was sufficiently appeased to allow him to be addressed as Excellency. All this was galling to Leicester's pride and ambition, and did not tend to improve his relations with the States. An English governor would in any case have had a difficult task, and Leicester had neither tact nor capacity as a statesman, and no pretensions as a military leader. He possessed no knowledge of the institutions of the country or the character of the people, and was ignorant of the Dutch language. The measures he took, and the arbitrary way in which he tried to enforce them, soon brought him face to face with the stubborn resistance of the Estates of Holland under the leadership of Alden Barnavelt. In April 1586 he issued a very stringent placard forbidding all traffic with the enemy's lands, and more especially the supplying of the enemy with grain. He meant it well, for he had been informed that the cutting off of this commerce, which he had regarded as illicit, would deprive the Spaniards of the necessaries of life, and Parma's position would become desperate. This carrying trade had, however, for long been a source of much profit to the merchants and ship owners of Holland and Zeeland. Indeed, it supplied no small part of the resources by which those 2 provinces had equipped the fleets and troops by which they had defended themselves against the efforts of the Spanish king. 2 years before this, the States General had tried to place an embargo on the traffic in grain, but the powerful town council of Amsterdam had refused obedience, and the Estates of Holland supported them in their action. The deputies of the inland provinces, which had suffered most from the Spanish armies, were jealous of the prosperity of the maritime states, and regarded this trade with the Spaniards as being carried on to their injury. But Holland and Zeeland supplied the funds without which resistance would long since have been impossible, and they claimed moreover, as sovereign provinces, the right to regulate their trade affairs. The edict remained a dead letter, for there was no power to enforce it. The governor made a still greater mistake when, in his annoyance at the opposition of the Hollanders, he courted the democratic anti-Holland party in Utrecht, which had as its leader the ultra-Calvinist stadtholder Nieuwenaar, and caused one of his confidants, a Brabander, Gerard Prounik, surnamed Deventer, to be elected burgomaster of Utrecht, although as a foreigner he was disqualified from holding that office. An even more arbitrary act was his creation of a Chamber of Finance armed with inquisitorial powers, thus invading the rights of the provincial estates and depriving the Council of State of one of its most important functions. To make matters worse, he appointed Nieuwenaar to preside over the new chamber, with a Brabander, Jacques Reingoud, as the Treasurer-General, and a Fleming, Daniel de Burggraeve, as auditor. The Estates of Holland, under the guidance of Alden Barnavelt, prepared themselves to resist stubbornly this attempt to thrust upon them a new tyranny. As a military leader, Leicester was quite unfitted to oppose successfully such a general as Parma. Both commanders were in truth much hampered by the preparations that were being made by Philip for the invasion of England. The king could spare Parma but little money for the pay of his troops, and his orders were that the Spanish forces in the Netherlands should be held in reserve and readiness for embarkation as soon as the Great Armada should hold command of the Channel. England was the first objective. When its conquest was accomplished, that of the rebel provinces would speedily follow. On the other hand, Elizabeth, always niggardly, was little disposed, in the face of the threatened danger, to dissipate her resources by any needless expenditure. Leicester therefore found himself at the head of far too small a force to deal any effective blows at the enemy. He succeeded in capturing Doesburg, but failed to take Zutphen. It was in a gallant effort to prevent a Spanish convoy from entering that town that Sir Philip Sidney met his death at the combat of Warnsveld, September 22, 1586. An important fort facing Zutphen was however stormed, and here Leicester left Sir Robert York with a strong garrison, and at the same time sent Sir William Stanley with 1200 men to be governor of Deventer. These appointments gave rise to much criticism that proved later to be fully justified, for both these officers were Catholics and had formerly been in the Spanish service. Leicester had also taken other steps that were ill-judged. West Friesland had for many years been united to Holland and was known as the North Quarter. The Governor-General, however, appointed Sonoy stadtholder of West Friesland, and was thus infringing the rights and jurisdiction of Maurice of Nassau. Maurice also held the post of Admiral-General of Holland and Zeeland, but Leicester took it upon himself to create 3 distinct Admiralty colleges, those of Holland, Zeeland and the North Quarter, thus further dividing authority in a land where greater unity was the chief thing to be aimed at. Leicester was equally unwise in the part he took in regard to religious matters. Alden Barnavelt, Paul Buys and the great majority of burgher regents in Holland belonged to the moderate, or, as it was called, the libertine party, to which William the Silent had adhered and whose principles of toleration he had strongly upheld. Leicester, largely influenced by spite against Alden Barnavelt and the Hollanders for their opposition to his edict about trade with the enemy and to his appointment of Sonoy, threw himself into the arms of the extreme Calvinists, who were at heart as fanatical persecutors as the Spanish inquisitors themselves. These precisian zealots held, by the Governor-General's permission and under his protection, a synod at Dort, June 1586, and endeavoured to organize the Reformed Church in accordance with their strict principles of exclusiveness. By this series of maladroit acts, Leicester had made himself so unpopular and distrusted in Holland that the Estates of that predominant province lost no opportunity of inflicting rebuffs upon him. Stung by the opposition he met and weary of a thankless task, the governor determined at the end of November to pay a visit to England. The Council of State was left in charge of the administration during his absence. His departure had the very important effect of bringing the question of state rights acutely to the front. The dislike and distrust felt by the Hollanders towards the English Governor-General was greatly increased by the treachery of York and Stanley, who delivered the fort at Zutphen and the town of Deventer, with the defence of which they had been charged, into the hands of the Spaniards. The town of Gelder and the fort at Wouw were likewise betrayed, and there can be small doubt that, had Parma at this time been able to take advantage of the dissensions in the ranks of his adversaries, he would have met with little effectual resistance to his arms. His whole attention was, however, centred in preparations for the proposed invasion of England. Leicester had no sooner left the country than the Estates of Holland, under the strong leadership of Alden Barnavelt, took measures to assert their rights to regulate their own affairs, independently of the Council of State. A levy of troops was made in the pay of the province of Holland, who were required to take an oath to the provincial estates and the stadtholder. To Maurice the title of Prince was given, and Sonoy in the North Quarter and all the commanders in fortified places were compelled to place themselves under his orders. The States General, in which the influence of Holland and its chief representative, Alden Barnavelt, was overpoweringly great, upheld the provincial estates in the measures they were taking. As a result of their action, the trade restrictions were practically repealed, the Council of State was reconstituted, and a strong indictment of Leicester's conduct and administration was drawn up in the name of the States General and forwarded to the absent governor in England. Elizabeth was indignant at the language of this document, but at this particular time the dangers which were threatening her throne and people were too serious for her to take any steps to alienate the States. It was her obvious policy to support them in their resistance, and to keep, if possible, Parma's forces occupied in the Netherlands. Accordingly, Leicester returned to his post July 1587, but in an altogether wrong spirit. He knew that he had a strong body of partisans in Utrecht, Friesland and elsewhere, for he had a post as the friend of the people's rights against the nobles and those burgher aristocracies in the cities in whose hands all real power rested, and by his attitude in religious matters he had won for himself the support of the Calvinist preachers. His agents, Deventer in Utrecht, Aisma in Friesland and Sonoy in the North Quarter, were able men who could count on the help of the democracy whom they flattered. So Leicester came back with the determination to override the opposition of the Estates of Holland and compel their submission to his will, but he found that he only succeeded in making that opposition more resolute. His attempts to overthrow the supremacy of the regents in Amsterdam, Leiden, Enkhuizen and other towns were complete failures. Alden Barnavelt and Maurice were supreme in Holland and Zeeland, and the power of the purse gave to Holland a controlling voice in the States General. The position of Leicester was shaken also by his inability to relieve Sluis, which important seaport fell after a long siege into Parma's hands August 5. Its capture was attributed by rumour, which in this case had no foundation, to the treachery of the English governor and garrison. Moreover, it was discovered that for some months secret peace negotiations had been passing between the English government and Parma, and this aroused violent suspicions that the Netherlands were merely being used as pawns in English policy, and alienated from the Governor-General the sympathy of the preachers, who had been his strongest supporters. Humiliated and broken in spirit, Leicester, after many bickerings and recriminations, finally left the Netherlands December 10, though his formal resignation of his post did not reach the States General until the following April. Lord Willoughby was placed in command of the English troops. The year 1588 was the beginning of a decade full of fate for the Dutch Republic. The departure of Leicester left the 7 provinces of the Union of Utrecht weak, divided, torn by factions, without allies, the country to the east of the IJssel and to the south of the Scheldt, and the Waal already in the hands of the enemy. Moreover, the armed forces of that enemy were far stronger than their own, and under the command of a consummate general. But this was the year of the Spanish Armada, and Parma's offensive operations were by the strictest orders from Madrid otherwise directed. and Elizabeth on her side, though highly offended at the treatment which her favourite Leicester had received from the Hollanders, was too astute to quarrel at such a moment with a people whose ships kept a strict blockade in the Scheldt and before the Flemish harbours. Thus a respite was obtained for the States at this critical time, which was turned to good account and was of vital import for their constitutional development. The Leicestrian period, despite its record of incompetence and failure, had, however, the distinction of being the period which, for good or for evil, gave birth to the Republic of the United Netherlands, as we know it in history. The curious, amorphous, hydra-headed system of government, which was to subsist for some 2 centuries, was in its origin the direct result of the confused welter of conflicting forces which was the legacy of Leicester's rule. As a preliminary to a right understanding of the political system, which was now, more by accidental force of circumstances than by design, developing into a permanent constitution, it will be necessary to trace the events of the years which immediately followed the departure of Leicester, and which were under the influence and by the cooperation of 3 striking personalities were to mould the future of the Dutch Republic. Those 3 personalities were John van Alden Barnavelt, Maurice of Nassau, and his cousin William Lewis of Nassau, the stadholder of Friesland. Born in 1547, Alden Barnavelt, after studying jurisprudence at Louvain, Berg and Heidelberg, became a devoted adherent of William the Silent and took part in the defence of Haarlem and of Leiden. His abilities, however, fitted him to take a prominent part as a politician and administrator rather than as a soldier, and his career may be said to have begun by his appointment to the post of pensionary of Rotterdam in 1576. In this capacity his industry and his talent speedily won for him a commanding position in the Estates of Holland, and he became one of the Prince of Orange's confidential friends and advisers. In 1586 he was appointed Advocate of Holland in succession to Paul Buys. This office included the duties of legal adviser, secretary and likewise in a sense that of speaker to the provincial estates. In addition to all this, he was the mouthpiece in the States General of the deputation representing the provincial estates, and exercised in that assembly all the authority attaching to the man who spoke in the name of Holland. At this time of transition, by his predominance alike in his own province of Holland and in the States General, he was able to secure for the general policy of the Union, especially in the conduct of foreign affairs, a continuity of aim and purpose that enabled the loosely cemented and mutually jealous confederacy of petty sovereign states to tide over successfully the critical years which followed the departure of Leicester, and to acquire a sense of national unity. The brain and the diplomatic skill of the great statesman would, however, have been of little avail without the aid and the military abilities of Maurice of Nassau. Maurice was 20 years of age when Leicester left Holland. He was a man very different from his father in opinions and in the character of his talents. Maurice had nothing of his father's tolerance in religious matters or his subtle skill in diplomacy. He was a born soldier but no politician, and had no wish to interfere in the affairs of state. He had the highest respect for Alden Barnavelt and complete confidence in his capacity as a statesman, and he was at all times ready to use the executive powers, which he exercised by virtue of the numerous posts he was speedily called upon to fill for the carrying out of Alden Barnavelt's policy, while the advocate on his side found in the strong arm of the successful general the instrument that he needed for the maintenance of his supremacy in the conduct of the civil government. Already in 1587 Maurice was stadholder of Holland and Zeeland. In 1588 he became Captain General and Admiral General of the Union with the control and supervision of all the armed forces of the provinces by sea and by land. The death of Nieuwenaar in the following year created a vacancy in the stadholderates of Utrecht, Gelderland and Overijssel. Maurice was in each province elected as Nieuwenaar's successor. The advocate, therefore, and the prince, through the close accord which was for many years to subsist between them, gathered thus into their hands, except in Friesland, practically the entire administrative, executive and military powers of the United Provinces, and by their harmonious co-operation with William Lewis, the wise and capable stadholder of Friesland, were able to give something of real unity to a group of states, each claiming to be a sovereign entity, and to give them the outward semblance of a federal republic. There was no eminent head, but the sovereignty in reality, if not in name, was vested during the period with which we now have to deal in this triumvirate. Circumstances provided a favourable field for the display of the youthful Maurice's military abilities. In 1589 the assassination of Henry III placed Henry of Navarre on the throne of France. The accession of the brilliant Huguenot leader led to civil war, and the Catholic opposition was encouraged and supported by Philip II, who regarded Henry IV as a menace and danger to the Spanish power. Parma, therefore, whose active prosecution of the war against the rebel provinces had been so long hindered by having to hold his army in readiness for the projected invasion of England, found himself, after the failure and destruction of the Armada, in no better position for a campaign in the northern Netherlands. Disappointment and false charges against him brought on a serious illness, and on his recovery he received orders to conduct an expedition into France. William Lewis of Nassau had for some time been urging upon the States General that the time for remaining upon the strict defensive was past, and that when the enemy's efforts were weakened and distracted, the best defence was a vigorous offensive. At first he spoke to deaf ears, but he found now a powerful supporter in Maurice, and the two stadholders prevailed. They had now by careful and assiduous training created a strong and well-disciplined army for the service of the States. This army was made up by contingents of various nationalities, English, Scottish, French and German, as well as Netherlanders. But the material was on the whole excellent, and the entire force was welded together by confidence in their leaders. In 1590 the capture of Breda by a ruse, 70 men hidden beneath a covering of peat making their entrance into the town and opening the gates to their comrades outside, was a good omen for the campaign that was planned for 1591. For the first time Maurice had an opportunity for showing his genius for war and especially for siege warfare. By rapid movements he took first Zutphen, then Deventer and Delfzijl, and relieved the fort of Knotsenburg near Nijmegen. Thus successful on the eastern frontier, the stadholder hurried to Zeeland and captured Hulst, the key to the land of Waas. He then turned his steps again to the east and appearing suddenly before Nijmegen made himself master of this important city. Such a succession of brilliant triumphs established Maurice's fame, and to a lesser degree that of William Lewis, whose co-operation and advice were of the greatest service to the younger man. This was markedly the case in the following year, 1592, when the two stadholders set to work to expel the Spaniards from the two strongly fortified towns of Steenwijk and Coevorden, whose possession enabled a strong force under the veteran Verdugo to retain their hold upon Friesland. The States army was not at its full strength, for the English contingent under Sir Francis Vere had been sent to France, and Verdugo was confident that any attempt to capture these well-garrisoned fortresses was doomed to failure. He had to learn how great was the scientific skill and resource of Maurice in the art of beleaguering. Steenwijk, after an obstinate defence, capitulated on June 5. Coevorden was then invested and in its turn had to surrender on September 12. During this time Parma had been campaigning with no great success in northern France. In the autumn he returned to the Netherlands, suffering from the effects of a wound and broken in spirit. Never did any man fill a difficult and trying post with more success and zeal than Alexander Farnese during the 16 years of his governor-generalship. Nevertheless, Philip was afraid of his nephew's talents and ambition, and he dispatched the Count of Fuentes with a letter of recall. It was never delivered. Parma set out to meet him, but fell ill and died at Spa, December 2, 1592. He appointed the Count of Mansfeld to take his place, until the Archduke Ernest of Austria, who had been appointed to succeed him, arrived in the Netherlands. The campaign of 1593 was marked by the taking of Geertruidenberg, a fortress which barred the free access of the Hollanders and Zeelanders to the inland waters. The science which Maurice displayed in the siege of this town greatly increased his renown. In the following year the stadholders turned their attention to the north-east corner of the land, which was still in the possession of the Spaniards. After a siege of 2 months Groningen surrendered, and the city with the surrounding district was by the terms of the capitulation, known as the Treaty of Reduction, admitted as a province into the Union under the name of Stad en Landen. William Lewis was appointed stadholder and Drenthe was placed under his jurisdiction. The northern Netherlands were now cleared of the enemy, and Maurice, at the conclusion of the campaign, made a triumphal entry into The Hague amidst general rejoicing. William Lewis lost no time in taking steps to establish Calvinism as the only recognized form of faith in his new government. His strong principles did not allow him to be tolerant, and to Catholicism he was a convinced foe. Everywhere throughout the United Provinces the Reformed religion was now dominant, and its adherents alone could legally take part in public worship. In January 1595 Henry IV declared war against Spain and was anxious for an alliance with the States against the common enemy. The Archduke Ernest, on whose coming into the Netherlands great hopes had been placed, found himself now in a difficult position with hostile armies threatening from both sides and no hope of efficient financial or other support from Spain. He was instructed therefore to enter into negotiations at The Hague with a view to the conclusion of a peace, based upon the terms of the pacification of Ghent. But there was never any prospect of an agreement being reached, and the sudden death of the Archduke, February 20, 1595, brought the negotiations to an end. Archduke Ernest was succeeded by the Count of Fuentes as governor ad interim. Fuentes proved himself to be a strong and capable commander, and the summer was marked by a series of successes against the hostile forces both of the French and the Netherlanders. There was no decisive encounter, but the Spanish forces foiled the efforts of their adversaries to effect an invasion or capture any towns. The Cardinal Archduke Albert arrived at Brussels to replace Fuentes in January 1596. Albert was the favourite nephew of King Philip and had been brought up at Madrid. Although an ecclesiastic, he proved himself to be a statesman and soldier of more than ordinary capacity. It was intended that he should, as soon as the Pope's consent could be obtained, divest himself of his orders and marry his cousin, the Infanta Isabel. The bankrupt condition of Spain prevented Philip from furnishing the Archduke with adequate financial help on entering upon his governorship, but Albert was provided with some money, and he found in the Netherlands the well-disciplined and war-tried force of which Fuentes had made such good use in the previous campaign. He was anxious to emulate that general success, and as the veteran leaders, Mondragon and Verdugo, had both died, he gave the command to the Seigneur de Roine, a French refugee. This man was a commander of skill and enterprise, and special circumstances enabled him by two brilliant offensive strokes to capture first Calais and afterwards Hulst. Hulst was only taken after a severe struggle in which de Roine himself fell. The special circumstances which favoured these operations were brought about by the conclusion of a treaty of alliance between France, England and the States. This treaty was the result of prolonged negotiations. It was of short duration and its conditions were far from favourable to the United Provinces, but it was of great importance from the fact that for the first time the new-fledged republic was recognized by the neighbouring sovereigns of France and England as an independent state and was admitted into alliance on terms of equality. It was, however, only with difficulty and through the insistence of Henry IV that Elizabeth was induced to acknowledge the independent status of the rebel provinces. In return, the Republic was required to keep up a force of 8,000 men for service in the Netherlands, and to dispatch 4,000 men to act with the French army in northern France. This auxiliary force to include the 5 English regiments in the state service. Thus Maurice was deprived of a considerable part of his army and obliged to act on the defensive. Elizabeth also insisted upon the carrying out of Leicester's placard forbidding trade with the enemy. This clause of the treaty was very unpalatable to Amsterdam and the Hollanders generally, and only a sullen acquiescence was given to it. From the first it was systematically evaded. The English government, on their part, undertook to support the French king with a force equal in strength to that furnished by the provinces, i.e. 4,000 men, but at the same time a secret treaty was drawn up, by which Henry agreed to a reduction of the English troops by 1/2. This piece of underhand work was in due time discovered by the States, who saw that their allies were not to be trusted, and that they must be on the watch, lest their interests should be sacrificed to the selfish policy of France. The issue showed that Henry IV was in fact ready to make terms with Spain as soon as it was to his advantage to do so. Meanwhile, in 1597, the French king, by advancing in force into Picardy, drew upon this frontier the chief attention of the Spaniards, and Maurice seized the opportunity that was offered to him to conduct an offensive campaign with signal success. He began the year brilliantly by surprising in January, while still in its winter quarters, a Spanish force of 4,500 near Turnhout. More than half the force was destroyed. On the side of the Netherlands, 8 men only fell. With the spring began a series of sieges, and, one after the other, Rijnberg, Meurs, Groenlo, Bredevoort, Enschede, Ootmarsum, Oldenzaal and Lingen were captured. Gelderland, Overijssel and Drenthe were entirely freed from the presence of the enemy. With the opening of 1598, Henry IV and Philip II entered upon negotiations for peace. The French king felt the necessity of a respite from war in order to reorganize the resources of his country, exhausted by a long continuance of civil strife, and Philip was ill and already feeling his end approaching. The States strove hard to prevent what they regarded as desertion, and 2 embassies were dispatched to France and to England to urge the maintenance of the alliance. Alden Barnavelt himself headed the French mission, but he failed to turn Henry from his purpose. A treaty of peace between France and Spain was signed at Vervins, May 2nd, 1598. Alden Barnavelt went from Paris to England and was more successful. Elizabeth bargained, however, for the repayment of her loan by annual instalments, and for armed assistance both by land and sea should an attack be made by the Spaniards on England. The Queen, however, made 2 concessions. Henceforth only 1 English representative was to have a seat in the Council of State, and all the English troops in the Netherlands, including the garrisons of the cautionary towns, were to take an oath of allegiance to the States. This year saw the accomplishment of a project on which the Spanish king had for some time set his heart, the marriage of the Cardinal Archduke Albert to his cousin the Infanta Isabel Clara Eugenia, and the erection of the Netherlands into an independent sovereignty under their joint rule. Philip hoped in this way to provide suitably for a well-beloved daughter, and at the same time, by the grant of apparent independence to the Netherland provinces, to secure their allegiance to the new sovereigns. The use of the word apparent is justified, for provision was made in the deed of cession that the Netherlands should revert to the Spanish crown in case the union should prove childless, and there was a secret agreement that the chief fortresses should still be garrisoned by Spanish troops, and that the archdukes, as they were officially styled, should recognize the suzerainty of the King of Spain. Philip did not actually live to carry his plan into execution. His death took place on September 13, 1598. But all the necessary arrangements for the marriage and the transfer of sovereignty had already been made. Albert, having first divested himself of his ecclesiastical dignities, was married by proxy to Isabel at Ferrara in November. It was not until the end of the following year that the new rulers made their joyeuse entrée into Brussels, but their marriage marks the beginning of a fresh stage in the history of the Netherlands. Albert and Isabel were wise and capable, and they succeeded in gaining the affection and willing allegiance in the southern provinces. The States General of the revolted provinces of the north had, however, already enjoyed for some years a real independence won by suffering and struggle, and they showed no disposition to meet the overtures of the archdukes. They were resolved to have no further connection with Spain or with Spanish rulers, and from this time forward the cleavage in character, sentiment, and above all in religion, between North and South was to become, as time went on, more and more accentuated. The Dutch Republic and the Spanish Netherlands were henceforth destined to pursue their separate course along widely divergent paths. The 10 years which had elapsed between the departure of Leicester and the advent of Albert and Isabel had witnessed a truly marvellous transformation in the condition of the rebel provinces, and especially of Holland and Zeeland. Gradually they had been freed from the presence of the Spaniards, while at the same time the Spanish yoke had been firmly riveted upon Flanders and Brabant. These provinces were now devastated and ruined. The quays of Antwerp were deserted, the industries of Ghent and Brugge destroyed. The most enterprising and skilful of their merchants and artisans had fled over the frontier into Holland, or across the sea into England. Holland and Zeeland were thronged with refugees, Flemings and Brabanders, French Huguenots and numerous Spanish and Portuguese Jews, driven out by the pitiless persecution of Philip II. The Hollanders and Zeelanders had long been a seafaring people, who had derived the chief part of their wealth from their fisheries and their carrying trade, and this influx of new and vigorous blood, merchants, traders and textile workers, bringing with them their knowledge, skill and energy, aroused such a phenomenal outburst of maritime and commercial activity and adventure as the world had never seen before. The fleets of the Hollanders and Zeelanders had, during the whole of the War of Independence, been the main defence of those provinces against Spanish invasion. But, great as had been the services they had rendered, it was the carrying trade which had furnished the rebel states with the sinews of war, and of this a large part had been derived from that very trading with the enemy which Leicester had striven in vain to prevent. The Spaniards and Portuguese were dependent upon the Dutch traders for the supply of many necessaries of life, and thus Spanish gold was made to pay for the support of the war which was waged against the Spanish king. The dues in connection with this trade, known as licenses and convoys, alone furnished large sums to replenish the war chest, and it is said that from 25,000 to 30,000 seamen found employment by it. Amsterdam during this decade had been rapidly growing in importance, and it was soon to be the first seaport in the world. It had become the emporium of the Baltic trade. In 1601 it is stated that between 800 and 900 ships left its quays in 3 days, carrying commodities to the Baltic ports. They came back laden with corn and other East Sea goods, which they then distributed in French, Portuguese and Spanish havens, and even as far as Italy and the Levant. Shipbuilding went on apace at Enkhuizen, Hoorn and other towns on the Zuiderzee, and Zaandam was soon to become a centre of the timber trade. In Zeeland, Middelburg, through the enterprise of an Antwerp refugee of French extraction by name Balthasar de Moucheron, was second only to Amsterdam as a seaport, while Dordrecht and Rotterdam were also busy with shipping. The energies of the Dutch at this springtide of their national life were far from being confined to European waters. Dutch sailors already knew the way to the East Indies round the Cape of Good Hope, through employment on Portuguese vessels, and the trade routes by which the Spaniards brought the treasures of the New World across the Atlantic were likewise familiar to them, and for a similar reason. The East Indies had for the merchants of Holland and Zeeland, ever keenly on the look-out for fresh markets, a peculiar attraction. At first the Cape route was thought to be too dangerous, and several attempts were made to discover a northwest passage along the coast of Siberia. Balthasar de Moucheron was the pioneer in these northern latitudes. He established a regular traffic with the Russians by way of the White Sea, and had a factory built in 1584 at Archangel. Through his instances, aided by those of the famous geographer Petrus Plancius, likewise a refugee from Antwerp, an expedition was fitted out and dispatched in 1594 to try to sail around northern Asia, but it was driven back after passing through the Waygate by ice and storms. A like fate befell a second expedition in the following year. Discouraged but still not despairing, a third fleet set out in 1596 under the command of Jacob van Heemskerk with William Barents as pilot. Forced to winter in Spitsbergen, after terrible sufferings, Heemskerk returned home in the autumn of 1597 with the remnant of his crews. Barents was one of those who perished. This was the last effort in this direction, for already a body of Amsterdam merchants had formed a company for trafficking to India by the Cape, and 4 ships had sailed, April 2, 1596, under the command of Cornelis Houtman, a native of Gouda. A certain Jan Huygen van Linschoten, who had been in the Portuguese service, had published in 1595 a book containing a description from personal knowledge of the route to the east and the character of the Portuguese commerce. It was the information contained in this work that led the Amsterdam merchants to venture their money upon Houtman's expedition, which Linschoten himself accompanied as guide. They reached Madagascar, Java and the Moluccas, and, after much suffering and many losses by sickness, what was left of the little fleet reached home in July 1597. The rich cargo they brought back, though not enough to defray expenses, proved an incentive to further efforts. 3 companies were formed at Amsterdam, 2 at Rotterdam, 1 at Delft and 2 in Zeeland for trading in the East Indies, all vying with one another in their eagerness to make large profits from these regions of fabled wealth, hitherto monopolized by the Portuguese. One expedition sent out by 2 Amsterdam companies under the command of Jacob van Neck and Wiebrand van Waarwijk was very successful and came back in 15 months richly laden with East Indian products. The year 1598 was one of great commercial activity. 22 large vessels voyaged to the East Indies, others made their way to the coasts of Guinea, Guyana and Brazil, and one daring captain, Olivier van Noort, sailing through the Straits of Magellan, crossed the Pacific. It was in this year that Philip II prohibited by decree all trading in Spain with the Dutch, and all the Dutch ships in the harbours of the peninsula were confiscated. But the Spanish trade was no longer of consequence to the Hollanders and Zeelanders. They had sought and found compensation elsewhere. The small companies formed to carry out these ventures in the far eastern seas continued to grow in number, and by the very keenness of their competition threatened each other's enterprises with ruin. In these circumstances the States General and the Estates of Holland determined, under the leadership of Alden Barnavelt, to take a step which was to be fraught with very important consequences. The rival companies were urged to form themselves into a single corporation, to which exclusive rights would be given for trading in the East Indies. Such a proposal was in direct contradiction to that principle of free trade, which had hitherto been dear to the Netherlanders, and there was much opposition, and many obstacles had to be overcome owing to the jealousies of the various provinces, towns and bodies of merchants who were interested. But at length the patience and statesmanship of Alden Barnavelt overcame all difficulties, and on March 20, 1601, a charter was issued creating the United East India Company and giving it a monopoly in the East India trade for 21 years, with all lands east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. The executive control was vested in a college known as the 17. Extensive sovereign privileges were conferred upon the company and exercised by the 17 in the name of the States General. They might make treaties with native rulers and potentates, erect forts for the protection of their factories, appoint governors and officials with administrative and judicial functions, and enlist troops. But these officials and troops were required to take an oath of allegiance to the States General. The States General themselves became participants by investing the £25,000 which the company had paid them for the grant of the charter. The capital speedily reached the amount of 6.5 million guilders. The warlike operations of the year 1599 were uneventful and in the main defensive, except on the eastern frontier, where the Spanish forces under the command of the Admiral of Aragon, Mendoza, captured Wesel and Rheinberg. The new rulers of the Netherlands, Albert and Isabel, did not make their entry into Brussels until the end of 1599, and almost before they had had time to organize the new government and gain firm possession of the reins of the power in the Belgic provinces, they found themselves confronted with a serious danger. The seaport of Dunkirk had for many years been a nest of pirates, who preyed upon Dutch commerce in the narrow seas. The States General, urged on by Alden Barnavelt, resolved in the spring of 1606 to dispatch an expedition to besiege and capture Dunkirk. Both Maurice and William Lewis were opposed to the project, which they regarded as rash and risky. The States General, however, hearing reports of the Archduke's soldiery being mutinous for lack of pay, persisted in their purpose, and Maurice, against his better judgment, acquiesced. A body of picked troops, 12,000 foot and 3,000 horse, was assembled on the island of Walcheren. A succession of contrary winds delaying the sailing of the force, it was determined to march straight through West Flanders to Newport and then along the shore to Dunkirk. A deputation of the States General, of which Alden Barnavelt was the leading member, went to Ostend to supervise, much to Maurice's annoyance, the military operations. The stadholder, however, reached Newport without serious opposition and proceeded to invest it. Meanwhile the Archduke Albert had been acting with great energy. By persuasive words and large promises he succeeded in winning back the mutineers, and at the head of a veteran force of 10,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry he followed Maurice and, advancing along the dunes, came on July 1 upon a body of 2,000 men, under the command of Ernest Casimir of Nassau, sent by the stadholder to defend the bridge of Leffingen. At the sight of the redoubtable Spanish infantry, a panic seized these troops, and they were routed with heavy loss. The fight, however, gave Maurice time to unite his forces and draw them up in battle order in front of Nieuport. Battle was joined the following afternoon, and slowly, foot by foot, after a desperate conflict, the Archduke's Spanish and Italian veterans drove back along the dunes the troops of the States. Every hillock and sandy hollow was fiercely contested, the brunt of the conflict falling on the English and Frisians under the command of Sir Francis Vere. Vere himself was severely wounded, and the battle appeared to be lost. At this critical moment the Spaniards began to show signs of exhaustion through their tremendous exertions in 2 successive fights under a hot sun in the yielding sand hills, and the prince, at the critical moment throwing himself into the midst of his retreating troops, succeeded in rallying them. At the same time he ordered some squadrons of cavalry which he had kept in reserve to charge on the flank of the advancing foe. The effect was instantaneous. The Spaniards were thrown into confusion, broke and fled. The victory was complete. The Archduke only just escaped capture, and of his army 5,000 perished and a large number were taken prisoners, among these the Admiral of Aragon. Almost by a miracle was the States' army thus rescued from a desperate position. Maurice's hard-won triumph greatly enhanced his fame, for the Battle of Nieuport destroyed the legend of the invincibility of the Spanish infantry in the open field. The victorious general, however, was not disposed to run any further risks. He accordingly retreated to Ostend and there embarked his troops for the ports from which they had started. The expedition had been very costly and had been practically fruitless. Alden Barnavelt and those who had acted with him were deeply disappointed at the failure of their plans for the capture of Dunkirk, and were far from satisfied with Maurice's obstinate refusal to carry out any further offensive operation. From this time there arose a feeling of soreness between the advocate and the stadholder, which further differences of opinion were to accentuate in the coming years. The vigour and powers of leadership displayed by their new sovereigns in meeting the invasion of Flanders by the States' army, though a defeat in the field had been suffered at Nieuport, had inspired their subjects in the southern Netherlands with confidence and loyalty. Albert had proved himself a brave commander, and his efforts had at least been successful in compelling the enemy to withdraw within his own borders. Ostend had long been a thorn in the side of the government at Brussels, and energetic steps were soon taken to besiege it. But the possession of Ostend was important also to Elizabeth, and she promised active assistance. The larger part of the garrison was, indeed, formed of English troops, and Sir Francis Vere was governor of the town. The siege which ensued was one of the memorable sieges of history. It lasted for more than 3 years. July 15, 1601 to September 20, 1604, and was productive of great feats of valour, skill and endurance on the part alike of besiegers and besieged. The States' army, under Maurice, though it did not march to the relief of Ostend, endeavoured to divert the attention of Albert from his objective by attacks directed elsewhere. In 1601 the fortresses of Rheinberg and Meurs on the Rhine were captured, and an attack made upon Hertogenbosch. In 1602 the important town of Grave on the Meuse was taken and a raid made into Brabant and Luxembourg. Meanwhile the defenders of Ostend had been making a desperate resistance, and little progress was made by the besiegers, with the result that a great drain was made upon the finances of the archdukes, and there were threatenings of mutiny among the troops. But the situation was saved by the intervention of a wealthy Genoese banker, Ambrosio de Spinola, who offered his services and his money to the archdukes, and promised that if he, though inexperienced in warfare, were given the command he would take Ostend. He fulfilled his promise. Without regard to loss of life he pressed on the siege, and though as fast as one line of defences was taken, another arose behind it to bar his progress, little by little he advanced, and bit by bit the area held by the garrison grew less. At last in the spring of 1604, under the pressure of the States General, Maurice led an army of 11,000 men into Flanders in April 1604 and laid siege to Sluis on May 19. Both Maurice and William Lewis were still unwilling to run the risk of an attack on Spinola's army in its lines, and so the two sieges went on side by side, as it were independently. Sluis fell at the end of August, and Ostend was then at its last gasp. Urged now by the deputies of the States to make a direct effort to relieve the heroic garrison, Maurice and his cousin, after wasting some precious time in protesting against the step, began to march southward. It was too late. What was left of Ostend surrendered on September 20, and Spinola became the master of a heap of ruins. It is said that this 3 years' siege cost the Spaniards 80,000 lives, to say nothing of the outlay of vast expenditure. Whether Maurice and William Lewis were right or wrong in their reluctance to assail Spinola's entrenched camp, it is certain that they were better judges of the military situation than the civilian deputies of the States. In any case, the capture of Sluis was an offset to the loss of Ostend, and its importance was marked by the appointment of Frederick Henry, the young brother of the stadholder, as governor of the seaport and the surrounding district, which received the name of States Flanders. The tremendous exertions put forward for the defence of Ostend had been a very serious drain upon the resources of the United Provinces, especially upon those of Holland. Taxation was already so high that Alden Barnavelt and many other leading members of the States General and Provincial Estates began to feel despondent and to doubt whether it were possible to continue the war. No longer could the States rely upon the assistance of England. James I had concluded peace with Spain, and, though he made professions of friendship and goodwill to the Dutch, wary statesmen like the Advocate did not trust him and were afraid lest he should be tempted to deliver up the cautionary towns into the hands of the enemy. Reverting to the policy of William the Silent, Alden Barnavelt even went so far as to make tentative approaches to Henry IV of France touching the conditions on which he would accept the sovereignty of the provinces. Indeed, it is said that such was the despair felt by this great statesman, who knew better than any man the economic difficulties of the situation, that he even contemplated the possibility of submission to the archdukes. Had he suggested submission, there would have been no question, however, that he could not have retained office, for Maurice, William Lewis and the military leaders on the one hand, and on the other the merchants and the adventurous seamen whom they employed in the profitable Indian traffic, would not have listened for a moment to any thought of giving up a struggle which had been so resolutely and successfully maintained for so many years. For financially the archdukes were in even worse plight than the Netherlanders, even though for a short time, with the help of Spinola, appearances seemed to favour the Belgic attacks on the Dutch frontier districts. In 1605 the Genoese general, at the head of a mixed but well-disciplined force in his own pay, made a rapid advance towards Friesland, and, after capturing Oldenzaal and Lingen and ravaging the eastern provinces, concluded the campaign with a brilliant success against a body of the States cavalry commanded by Frederick Henry, who nearly lost his life. Maurice with inferior forces kept strictly on the defensive, skilfully covering the heart of the land from attack, but steadily refusing a pitched battle. In the following year Spinola with 2 armies attempted to force the lines of the Waal and the IJssel, but, though thwarted in this aim by the wariness of the stadholder and by a very wet season, he succeeded in taking the important fortresses of Grol and Rijnberg. Maurice made no serious effort to relieve them, and his inactivity caused much discontent and adverse comment. His military reputation suffered, while that of his opponent was enhanced, but subsequent events showed that Maurice, though perhaps erring on the side of caution, had acted rightly. The armies which had threatened the safety of the provinces had been raised at the charges of a private individual, but the financial resources, even of a Spinola, were not capable of a prolonged effort. There was no money in the state treasury, and the soldiery, as soon as their pay was in arrears, began once more to be mutinous. The bolt had been shot without effect, and the year 1607 found both sides, through sheer lack of funds, unable to enter upon a fresh campaign on land with any hope of definite success. But though the military campaigns had been so inconclusive, it had been far different with the fortunes of maritime warfare in these opening years of the 17th century. The sea power of the Dutch Republic was already a formidable factor which had to be reckoned with, and which was destined to be decisive. The East India Company was no sooner founded than active steps were taken to make full use of the privileges granted by the Charter. A fleet of 17 vessels was dispatched in 1602 under Wybrand van Warwijk. Warwijk visited Ceylon and most of the islands of the Malay archipelago, established a factory at Bantam with a staff of officials for developing trade relations with the natives, and even made his way to Siam and China. He sent back from time to time some of his vessels richly laden, and finally returned himself with the residue of his fleet after an absence of 5 years in June 1607. Another expedition of 13 ships sailed in 1604 under Steven van der Hagen, whose operations were as widespread and as successful as those of Warwijk. Van der Hagen took possession of Molucca and built factories at Amboina, Tidor and other places in the spice-bearing islands. On his way back in 1606 with his cargo of cloves, spices and other products of the Far Orient, he encountered at Mauritius another westward-bound fleet of 11 ships under Cornelis Matelief. Matelief's first objective was the town of Malacca, held by the Portuguese and commanding the straits to which it gave its name. Alfonso de Castro, the Viceroy of India, hastened however with a naval force far more powerful than the Dutch squadron to the relief of this important fortress, and after a hardly fought but indecisive action, Matelief raised the siege on August 17. Returning, however, about a month later, the Dutch admiral found that de Castro had sailed away, leaving only a detachment of 10 vessels before Malacca. Matelief at once attacked this force, whose strength was about equal to his own, and with such success that he sank or burnt every single ship of the enemy with scarcely any loss, September 21, 1606. These successful incursions into a region that the Spaniards and Portuguese had jealously regarded as peculiarly their own aroused both anger and alarm. All available forces in the east, the Portuguese from the Mozambique and Goa, the Spaniards from the Philippines, were equipped and sent to sea with the object of expelling the hated and despised Netherlanders from East Indian waters. Paulus van Caerden, Matelief's successor in command, was defeated and himself taken prisoner. Nor were the Spaniards content with attacking the Dutch fleets in the Far East. As the weather-worn and heavily laden company's vessels returned along the west coast of Africa, they had to pass within striking distance of the Spanish and Portuguese harbours, and were in constant danger of being suddenly assailed by a superior force and captured. In 1607 rumours reached Holland of the gathering of a large Spanish fleet at Gibraltar, whose destination was the East Indies. The directors of the company were much alarmed, an alarm which was shared by the States General, many of whose deputies were cargo shareholders. Accordingly, in April 1607, a fleet of 26 vessels set sail for the purpose of seeking out and attacking the Spaniards, whether in harbour or on open sea. The command was given to one of the most daring and experienced of Dutch seamen, Jacob van Heemskerk. He found 21 ships still at anchor in Gibraltar Bay, 10 of them large galleons, far superior in size and armament to his own largest vessels. Heemskerk at once cleared for action. Both Heemskerk and the Spanish commander, Davila, were killed early in the fight, the result of which, however, was not long doubtful. The Spanish fleet was practically destroyed. On the Dutch side no vessel was lost, and the casualties were small. Such a disaster was most humiliating to Castilian pride, and its effect in hastening forward the peace negotiations, which were already in progress, was considerable. The initial steps had been taken by the archdukes through the secret agency of Albert's Franciscan confessor, Father John Nijen. Both Alden Barnavelt and Maurice were approached in May 1606, but without any result. Early in 1607, however, the efforts were renewed, and negotiations were actively set on foot for the purpose of concluding a peace or a truce for a term of 12, 15 or 20 years. There were, however, almost insuperable difficulties in the way. In the first place, the stadholders, the military and naval leaders, the Calvinist clergy and the great majority of the traders honestly believed that a peace would be detrimental to all the best interests of the states, and were thoroughly distrustful of the motives which had prompted the archdukes and the Spanish government to make these advances. Alden Barnavelt, on the other hand, thought that peace was necessary for the land to recuperate after the exhausting struggle which had already lasted for 40 years, and he found strong support among the burgher regions and that large part of the people who were overburdened and impoverished by the weight of taxation, and sick and weary of perpetual warfare. There were, however, certain preliminary conditions, which all were agreed must be assented to, and without which it would be useless to continue the negotiations. The independence of the United Provinces must be recognised, freedom of trade in the Indies conceded, and the public exercise of Catholic worship prohibited. After some parleying the Archdukes agreed to treat with the United Provinces in the quality and as considering them free provinces and states, and an armistice was concluded in April 1607 for 8 months, in order that the matters in dispute might be referred to the King of Spain and his views upon them ascertained. Not until October did the king's reply arrive at Brussels. He consented to negotiate with the States as free and independent parties, but he required that liberty of Catholic worship should be permitted during the truce, and no mention was made of the Indian trade. This was by no means satisfactory. Nevertheless, the influence of Alden Barnavelt prevailed and the negotiations were not broken off. On February 1, 1608, the Archduke's envoys, the 2 leading members being Ambrosio de Spinola and the president of the Privy Council, Ricardo, arrived in Holland. They were met at Rijswijk by Maurice and William Lewis in person, and with much ceremony and splendour a solemn entry was made into The Hague, the procession with the brilliant retinues forming a memorable spectacle as it made its way through the crowds which lined the roads. The negotiations were conducted in the Binnenhof. The special commissioners to represent the States General were William Lewis of Nassau, Walraven, Lord of Brederode, and a deputy from each of the provinces under the leadership of Alden Barnavelt. Envoys from France, England, Denmark, the Palatinate and Brandenburg were present, took part in the discussions and acted as friendly mediators. The question of treating the United Provinces as free states was soon settled. The Archdukes, who were aiming at the conclusion of a truce in which to recuperate and not of a definite peace, showed an unexpected complaisance in granting a concession which they regarded as only temporary. Then came the really serious questions as to freedom of trade in the Indies and the liberty of Catholic worship. Of these, the first was of most immediate interest, and showed irreconcilable differences between the 2 parties. The Spaniards would never consent to any trespassing in the closed area, which they regarded as their own peculiar preserve. The Dutch traders and sailors were fired with the spirit of adventure and of profit, and their successful expeditions had aroused an enthusiasm for further effort in the distant seas, which had hardened into a fixed resolve not to agree to any peace or truce shutting them out from the Indian trade. For months the subject was discussed and rediscussed without result. Some of the foreign delegates left. The armistice was prolonged in order that Father Nyen might go to Madrid for further instructions. It was found, however, that the King of Spain would yield nothing. The negotiations came to a standstill, and both sides began to make preparations for a renewal of the war. President Jeannin, on behalf of the French king, by his skilful mediation, in which he was supported by his English colleague, saved the situation. He proposed as a compromise a 12 years' truce, pointing out that whatever terms were arranged would only be binding for that short period. He managed to bring about a personal interview between Alden Barnavelt and Maurice, who had respectively headed the peace and war parties in the provinces, and henceforth both consented to work together for this proposal of a limited truce, during which the trade to the Indies should be open and the religious question be untouched. The assent of the States General and of the several provincial estates was obtained. The 2 most interested, Holland and Zeeland, were won over, Holland by the arguments and persuasions of the advocate, Zeeland, which was the last to agree, by the influence of Maurice. Jeannin was aware that the finances of Spain were at their last gasp, and that both the Archdukes and Philip III were most anxious for a respite from the ever-consuming expense of the war. At last the long and wearisome negotiations came to an end, and the treaty concluding a truce for 12 years was signed at The Hague on April 9, 1609. The territorial status quo was recognized. The United Provinces were treated as free states over which the Archdukes made no pretension. Nothing was said about the religious difficulty nor about trade in the Indies, but in a secret treaty the King of Spain undertook not to interfere with Dutch trade wherever carried on. Thus access to the Indies was conceded, though to save appearances the word was not mentioned. This result was due solely to the diplomatic tact and resource of Jeannin, who was able to announce to Henry IV that he had accomplished his task to the satisfaction of everyone, and even of Prince Maurice. End of chapter 6.
Is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. History of Holland by George Edmundson. Chapter 7. The System of Government. One of the reasons which influenced the Archdukes and the King of Spain to make large concessions in order to secure the assent of the States General to the conclusion of a 12 years' truce, was their firm belief that the unstable political condition of the United Provinces must lead to civil discord, as soon as the relaxing of the pressure of war loosened the bonds which had, since Leicester's departure, held together a number of separate authorities and discordant interests. They were right in their supposition. In order, therefore, to understand the course of events in the Republic, which had been correctly recognised by the treaty not as a single state, but as a group of free and independent states, it is necessary to give a brief account of one of the most strangely complicated systems of government that the world has ever seen, especially strange because no one could ever say positively where or with whom the sovereignty really resided. Let us take into separate consideration the powers and functions of 1. The Council of State, 2. The States General, 3. The Provincial Estates, 4. The Stadholders, 5. The Advocate, later the Raad Pensionarius or Council Pensionary of Holland, 6. The Admiralty Colleges. The Council of State was not a legislative but an executive body. In the time of Leicester the Council was the executive arm of the Governor-General and had large powers. After his departure, the presence of the English ambassador, who by treaty had a seat in a council, caused the States General gradually to absorb its powers and to make its functions subordinate to their own, until at last its authority was confined to the administration of the affairs of war and of finance. The right of the English representative to sit in the council and take an active part in its deliberations continued until 1626. The stadholders were also ex officio members. The provinces, since 1588, were represented by 12 councillors. Holland had 3, Gelderland, Zeeland and Friesland, 2 each, Utrecht, Overijssel and Kernighan, Stad en Landry, 1 each. The Treasurer-General and the Clerk, Griffier, of the States General took part in the deliberations and had great influence. The chief duty of the Council, during the period with which we are dealing, was the raising of the quotas from the various provinces for the military defence of the state. The general petition, or war budget, was prepared by the Council and presented to the States General at the end of each year, providing for the military expenses in the following 12 months. The quotas due towards these expenses from the several provinces were set forth in smaller petitions sent to the provincial estates, whose consent was necessary. The so-called repartitie fixing the amount of these quotas was likewise drawn up by the Council of State, and was the subject at times of considerable haggling and discontent. In 1612 it was settled that the proportions to be borne by the provinces should be Holland 57.1%, Friesland 11.4%, Zeeland 11%, afterwards reduced to 9%, Utrecht and Kernighan 5.5%, Overijssel 3.5%. It will thus be seen that the quota of Holland was considerably more than half of the whole, and as the naval expenditure was to an even larger extent borne by Holland, the preponderating influence of this province in the Union can easily be understood. The forces of the Republic that were distributed in the several provinces received their pay from the provinces, but those maintained by the Council as troops of state were paid by moneys received from the Generality lands, i.e. lands such as the conquered portions of Brabant and Flanders, governed by the States General, but without representation in that body. The Council of State, though its political powers were curtailed and absorbed by the States General, continued to exercise, as a court of justice, appellate jurisdiction in military and financial questions. The States General consisted of representatives of the estates of the 7 sovereign provinces of Gelderland, Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Friesland, Overijssel and Kernighan, Stad en Landry, in the order of precedence given above. Gelderland, having been a duchy, ranked before those that had formerly been counties or lordships. The provinces sent deputations varying in number, Holland and Gelderland generally 6, the others less. Each province had but a single vote. The president changed week by week, being chosen in turn from each province according to their order of precedence. Holland had nominally no more weight than the others. Its practical influence, however, was great in proportion to the burden of taxation that it bore, and was increased by the fact that the sessions, which after 1593 were permanent, were held at the Hague in the same building with the Estates of Holland, and that the council pensionary of Holland was the spokesman of the province in the States General. The States General had control of the foreign affairs of the Union. To them belonged the supreme control of military and naval matters. The Captain General and Admiral General of the Union were appointed by them, and a deputation of the States General accompanied the army into the field, and the commanders were bound to consult it. They exercised a strong supervision of finance, and sovereign authority over the entire administration of the Generality lands. Ambassadors were appointed by them, also the Treasurer General of the Union and numerous other important officials. Yet, with all these attributes and powers, the States General possessed only a derived, not an inherent authority. To foreigners, the sovereignty of the Republic of the United Netherlands appeared to be vested in their High Mightinesses. In reality, the States General was, as already stated, a gathering of deputations from the 7 sovereign provinces. Each deputation voted as a unit, and in all important affairs of peace and war, treaties and finance, there must be no dissentient. A single province, however small, could by obstinate opposition block the way to the acceptance of any given proposal. Moreover, the members, despite their lofty designation as High Mightinesses, did not vote according to their convictions or persuasions, but according to the charge they had received from their principals. The deputation of a province had no right to sanction any disputable measure or proposal without referring it back to the Estates of that province for approval or disapproval. Hence arose endless opportunities and occasions for friction and dissension, and manifold delays in the transaction of the business of the Republic, oftentimes in a manner inimical to its vital interests. The provincial estates, in their turn, were by no means homogeneous or truly representative bodies. In Holland the nobles had 1 vote, and 18 towns, Dordrecht, Haarlem, Delft, Leyden, Amsterdam, Gouda, Rotterdam, Gorkum, Schiedam, Schoonhoven, Brill, Alkmaar, Hoorn, Enkhuizen, Edam, Monnikendam, Medemblik and Purmerend had 1 each. The nobles, though they had only 1 vote, were influential, as they represented the rural districts, and the small towns which had no franchise, and they voted first. Here again, as in the States General, though each of the privileged towns counted equal in the voting, as a matter of fact their weight and influence was very different. The opposition of wealthy and populous Amsterdam was again and again sufficient to override the decision of the majority, for there was no power to enforce its submission except the employment of armed force. For at this point it may be as well to explain that each one of these municipalities, Vroedschappen, claimed to be a sovereign entity, and yet, far from being bodies representing the citizens as a whole, they were close corporations of the narrowest description. The ordinary inhabitants of these towns had no voice whatever in the management of their own affairs. The governing body, or Vroedschap, consisted of a limited number of persons, sometimes not more than 40, belonging to certain families, which filled up vacancies by co-option, and chose the burgomasters and sheriffs, schepenen. Thus it will be seen that popular representation had no place in Holland. The Regent Burgers were a small patrician oligarchy, in whose hands the entire government and administration of the towns rested, and from their number were chosen the deputies who represented the 18 privileged cities in the provincial estates. The other provinces do not need such detailed notice. In Zeeland the estates consisted of 7 members, the first noble, who presided, and 6 towns. There was but one noble, the Marquis of Flushing and Veere. William the Silent in 1581 obtained this marquisate by purchase, and his heirs through its possession continued to exercise great influence in the provincial estates. As Philip William, Prince of Orange, was in Madrid, Maurice sat in the assembly as first noble in his place. In Utrecht the 3 estates were represented, i.e. the nobles, the towns, 4 in number, and the clergy. The representatives of the clergy were, however, chosen no longer from the chapter, but from the possessors of what had been church lands and property. They were elected by the knights and the small towns, out of a list drawn up by the corporation of Utrecht. They necessarily belonged to the Reformed (Calvinist) faith. Gelderland was divided into 3 so-called quarters: Nijmegen, Zutphen and Arnhem. Each of these quarters had its separate assembly, and there was also a general diet. The nobles, who were numerous and had large estates, were here very influential. Friesland was divided into 4 quarters, 3 of which, Oostergoo, Westergoo and Zevenwolden, were country districts, the 4th a gathering of the deputies of 11 towns. The Diet of Friesland was not formed of estates, the nobles and the town representatives sitting together in the same assembly, which was elected by a popular vote, all who had a small property qualification possessing the franchise, Roman Catholics excepted. The system of administration and divided authority was in Friesland a very complicated one, inherited from medieval times, but here again the nobles, being large landowners, had much influence. The stadholder presided at the diet and had a casting vote. The Estates of Kernighan were divided into 2 parts, town and districts, each with 1 vote. The districts were those of Hunsingoo, Fivelingoo and the West Quarter. Here also the stadholder had a casting vote. In Overyssel the estates, like those of Kernighan, consisted of 2 members, the nobles from the 3 quarters, Salland, Twente and Vollenhove, and the deputies of the 3 towns, Deventer, Kampen and Zwolle. The ordinary executive and administrative work of provincial government was carried out in Holland by a body known as the Commissioned Councillors, Gekommandeerraden. In the other provinces by deputed estates, Gedeputeerde Staten. The Commissioned Councillors were to the Estates of Holland what the Council of State was to the States General. They enjoyed considerable independence, for they were not appointed by the Estates, but directly by the nobles and cities according to a fixed system of rotation, and they sat continuously, whereas the Estates only met for short sessions. Their duty was to see that all provincial edicts and ordinances decreed by the Estates were published and enforced, to control the finances, and to undertake the provision and oversight of all military requirements, and to them it belonged to summon the meetings of the Estates. The deputed estates in the other provinces had similar but generally less extensive and authoritative functions. Such a medley of diverse and often conflicting authorities within a state of so small an area has no counterpart in history. It seemed impossible that government could be carried on, or that there could be any concerted action or national policy in a republic which was rather a many-headed confederation than a federal state. That the United Netherlands, in spite of all these disadvantages, rapidly rose in the 17th century to be a maritime and commercial power of the first rank, was largely due to the fact that the foreign policy of the Republic, and the general control of its administration was directed by a succession of very able men, the stadholders of the House of Orange-Nassau and the council pensionaries of Holland. For a right understanding of the period of Dutch history with which we are about to deal, it is necessary to define clearly what was the position of the stadholder and of the council pensionary in this cumbrous and creaking machinery of government that has just been described, and the character of those offices which conferred upon their holders such wide-reaching influence and authority. The stadholder or governor was really, both in title and office, an anomaly in a republic. Under the Burgundian and Habsburg rulers, the stadholder exercised the local authority in civil and also in military matters, as representing the sovereign duke, count or lord in the province to which he was appointed, and was by that fact clothed with certain sovereign attributes during his tenure of office. William the Silent was stadholder of Holland and Zeeland at the outbreak of the revolt, and, though deprived of his offices, he continued until the time of the Union of Utrecht to exercise authority in those and other provinces professedly in the name of the king. After his death, one would have expected that the office would have fallen into abeyance, but the coming of Leicester into the Netherlands led to a revival of the stadholderate. Holland and Zeeland, in their desire to exercise a check on the Governor-General's arbitrary exercise of his powers, appointed Maurice of Nassau to take his father's place, and at the same time William Lewis of Nassau became stadholder of Friesland, and stadholders were also appointed in Utrecht, Gelderland and Overijssel. In 1609 Maurice was stadholder in the 5 provinces of Holland, Zeeland, Gelderland, Utrecht and Overijssel, his cousin William Lewis in Friesland and Kernighan with Drenthe. The powers of the stadholder were not the same in the different provinces, but generally speaking he was the executive officer of the estates, and in Holland, where his authority was the greatest, he had the supervision of the administration of justice, the appointment of a large number of municipal magistrates, and the prerogative of pardon, and he was charged with the military and naval defence of the province. The stadholder received his commission both from the provincial estates and from the States General, and took an oath of allegiance to the latter. In so far then as he exercised quasi-sovereign functions, he did it in the name of the States, whose servant he nominally was. But when the stadholder, as was the case with Maurice and the other princes of Orange, was himself a sovereign prince and the heir of a great name, he was able to exercise an authority far exceeding those of a mere official. The descendants of William the Silent, Maurice, Frederick Henry, William II and William III, were, moreover, all of them men of exceptional ability, and the stadholderate became in their hands a position of almost semi-monarchical dignity and influence, the stadholder being regarded both by foreign potentates and by the people of the Netherlands generally as the eminent head of the state. Maurice, as stated above, was stadholder in 5 provinces, Frederick Henry, William II and William III in 6, the 7th province, Friesland, remaining loyal, right through the 17th century, to their cousins of the House of Nassau-Siegen, the ancestors of the present Dutch royal family. That the authority of the States General and States Provincial should from time to time come into conflict with that of the stadholder was to be expected, for the relations between them were anomalous in the extreme. The stadholder of Holland, for instance, appointed, directly or indirectly, the larger part of the municipal magistrates, they, in their turn, the representatives who formed the estates of the province. But, as the stadholder was the servant of the estates, he, in a sense, may be said to have had the power of appointing his own masters. The stadholders of the House of Orange had also, in addition to the prestige attaching to their name, the possession of large property and considerable wealth, which, with the emoluments they received from the States General, as Captain General and Admiral General of the Union, and from the various provinces where they held the post of stadholder, enabled them in the days of Frederick Henry and his successors to maintain the state and dignity of a court. The office of Land's Advocate, or council pensionary, was different altogether in character from the stadholderate, but at times scarcely less influential when filled by a man of commanding talents. The advocate in the time of Alden Barnavelt combined the duties of being legal adviser to the Estates of Holland and of presiding over and conducting the business of the estates at their meetings, and also those of the commissioned councillors. He was the leader and spokesman of the Holland deputies in the States General. He kept the minutes, introduced the business, and counted the votes at the provincial assemblies. It was his duty to call up and register the resolutions. What was perhaps equally important, he carried on the correspondence with the ambassadors of the Republic at foreign courts, and received their dispatches, and conducted negotiations with the foreign ambassadors at the Hague. It is easy to see how a man like Alden Barnavelt, of great industry and capacity for affairs, although nominally the paid servant of the estates, gradually acquired an almost complete control over every department of administration, and became, as it were, a minister of state of all affairs. In Alden Barnavelt's time the post was held for life, and as Maurice did not for many years trouble himself about matters of internal government and foreign diplomacy, the advocate, by the length of his tenure of office, had at the opening of the 17th century become the virtual director and arbiter of the policy of the state. After his death the title of advocate and the life tenure ceased. His successors were known as council pensionaries, and they held office for 5 years only, but with the possibility of re-election. The career of John de Witt showed, however, that in the case of a supremely able man these restrictions did not prevent a rad pensionarius from exercising for 18 years an authority and influence greater even than that of Alden Barnavelt. An account of the multiplied subdivision of administrative control in the United Provinces would not be complete without some mention of the Admiralty colleges in Holland. Holland, with Zeeland, furnished the fleets on which the existence and well-being of the Republic depended. Both William the Silent and his son Maurice were, as stadholders, admirals of Holland and of Zeeland, and both likewise were, by the States General, appointed Admirals General of the Union. They thus wielded a double authority over maritime affairs in the two provinces. In 1574 William had at his side a Council of Admiralty erected by the Provincial Estates, but Leicester in 1585 was annoyed by the immediate control of naval matters being withdrawn from the Governor-General and the Council of State. He succeeded therefore in obtaining a division of the Council of Admiralty into 3 chambers, shortly afterwards increased to 5, Rotterdam, Hoorn with Enkhuizen, Veer, Amsterdam, and Harlingen with Dokkum. In 1597 it was determined that each admiralty should consist of 7 members nominated by the States General. The Admiral General presided over each college and over joint meetings of the 5 colleges. The Admiralties nominated the lieutenants of the ships and proposed a list of captains, to be finally chosen by the States General. The Lieutenant Admiral and Vice Admirals of Holland and the Vice Admiral of Zeeland were chosen by the Provincial Estates. The States General appointed the Commander-in-Chief. Such a system seemed to be devised to prevent any prompt action or swift decision being taken at times of emergency or sudden danger. End of chapter 7.
Is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of Holland by George Edmundson. Chapter 8. The 12 Years' Truce. The first years of the truce were for the United Provinces, now recognised as free and independent states, a period of remarkable energy and enterprise. The young republic started on its new career with the buoyant hopefulness that comes from the proud consciousness of suffering and dangers bravely met and overcome, and, under the wise and experienced guidance of Alden Barnavelt, acquired speedily a position and a weight in the councils of Europe out of all proportion to its geographical area or the numbers of its population. The far-seeing statecraft and practised diplomatic skill of the Advocate never rendered greater services to his country than during these last years of his long tenure of power. A difficult question as to the succession to the Julius Cleves duchies arose at the very time of the signing of the truce, which called for delicate and wary treatment. In March 1609 the Duke of Jülich and Cleves died without leaving a male heir, and the succession to these important border territories on the Lower Rhine became speedily a burning question. The two principal claimants through the female line were the Elector of Brandenburg and William, Count Palatine of Neuburg. The Emperor Rudolph II, however, under the pretext of appointing imperial commissioners to adjudicate upon the rival claims, aroused the suspicions of Brandenburg and Neuburg, and these two came to an agreement to enter into joint possession of the duchies, and were styled the possessors. The Protestant Union at Heidelberg recognized the possessors, for it was all important for the balance of power in Germany that these lands should not pass into the hands of a Catholic ruler of the House of Austria. For the same reason Brandenburg and Neuburg were recognized by the States General, who did not wish to see a partisan of Spain established on their borders. The emperor on his part not only refused to acknowledge the possessors, but he also sent his cousin Archduke Leopold, Bishop of Passau, to intervene by armed force. Leopold seized the fortress of Jülich and proceeded to establish himself. It was an awkward situation, for neither the United Provinces nor the archdukes nor the King of Spain had the smallest desire to make the Jülich succession the cause of a renewal of hostilities immediately after the conclusion of the truce. The eagerness of the French king to precipitate hostilities with the Habsburg powers, however, forced their hands. Henry IV had for some time been making preparations for war, and he was at the moment irritated by the protection given by the archdukes to the runaway Princess of Condé, who had fled to Brussels. He had succeeded in persuading the States to send an auxiliary force into Germany to assist the French army of invasion in the spring of 1610, when, just as the king was on the point of leaving Paris to go to the front, he was assassinated on May 14th. This event put an end to the expedition, for the regent Marie de Medici was friendly to Austria. The States, nevertheless, did not feel disposed to leave Leopold in possession of Jülich. Maurice led an army into the duchy and laid siege to the town. It capitulated on September 1st. As might have been anticipated, however, the joint rule of the possessors did not turn out a success. They quarrelled, and Neuburg asked for Catholic help. Maurice and Spinola in 1614 found themselves again face to face at the head of rival forces. But actual hostilities were avoided, and by the Treaty of Nanton, November 12, 1614, it was arranged that the disputed territory should be divided, Brandenburg ruling at Cleves, Neuburg at Jülich. Thus, in the settlement of this thorny question, the influence of Olden Barnavelt worked for a temporary solution satisfactory to the interest of the United Provinces, nor was his successful intervention in the Jülich-Cleves affair an isolated instance of his diplomatic activity. On the contrary, it was almost ubiquitous. The growth of the Dutch trade in the Baltic had for some years been advancing by leaps and bounds, and now far exceeded that of their old rivals, the Hanseatic League. Christian IV, the ambitious and warlike King of Denmark, had been seriously interfering with this trade by imposing such heavy dues for the passage of the Sound as on the one hand to furnish him with a large revenue, and on the other hand to support his claim to sovereign rights over all traffic with the inland sea. The Hanse towns protested strongly and sought the support of the States General in actively opposing the Danish king. It was granted. A force of 7,000 men under Frederick Henry was sent into Germany to the relief of Brunswick, which was besieged by Christian IV. The siege was raised, and an alliance was concluded between the Republic and the Hanse towns for common action in the protection of their commercial interests. Nor was this all. Alden Barnavelt entered into diplomatic relations with Charles IX of Sweden and with Russia. Cornelius Haga was sent to Stockholm, and from this time forward a close intimacy was established between Sweden and the States. The seaport at Gothenburg, just outside the entrance to the Sound, was founded by a body of Dutch colonists under a certain Abraham Cabello, an Amsterdam merchant, and continued to be for years practically a Dutch town. Scarcely less important was the enterprise shown in the establishment of friendly relations with distant Russia. Balthazar de Moucheron established a Dutch factory at Archangel so early as 1584, and a growing trade sprang up with Russia by way of the White Sea, at first in rivalry with the English Muscovy Company. But a Dutch merchant by name Isaac Massa having succeeded in gaining the ear and confidence of the Czar, Russian commerce gradually became a Dutch monopoly. In 1614 a Muscovite embassy conducted by Massa came to The Hague, and access to the interior of Russia was opened to the traders of Holland and to them only. In the Mediterranean no less foresight and dexterity was shown in forwarding the interests of the States. The Advocate's son-in-law, Van der Myle, went in 1609 as ambassador to Venice, and the following year the first Venetian envoy, Tommaso Contarini, arrived in Holland. In 1612 Cornelius Haga, who had been in Sweden, was sent to Constantinople to treat with the Turks about commercial privileges in the Levant and for the suppression of piracy, and he remained in the East in charge of the Republic's interests for many years. More difficult was the maintenance of friendly relations with England. In 1604 James I had made peace with Spain, and the growing rivalry upon the seas between the Dutch and English tended to alienate his sympathies from the rising maritime power of the Republic. He outwardly maintained friendly relations. His ambassador had a seat on the Council of State. He retained his garrisons in the cautionary towns, and after the signing of the truce he bestowed the Garter upon Prince Maurice. But at this very time, May 1609, James took a step which was most hurtful to that industry which had laid the foundation of the commercial prosperity of Holland. This was the issuing of an edict imposing a tax on all foreigners fishing in English waters. Though general in its form, this edict was really directed against the right heretofore enjoyed by the Netherlands to fish on the English coast, a right conferred by a series of treaties and never challenged since its confirmation by the Magnus Intercursus of 1496. Dutch public opinion was strongly aroused, and a special embassy was sent to London, April 1610, to protest against the edict and endeavour to procure its withdrawal or its modification. This was by no means an easy matter. The fisheries on which a large part of the population of Holland and Zeeland depended for their livelihood were of vital importance to the States. On the other hand, their virtual monopoly by the Dutch caused keen resentment in England. In the latter part of the reign of Elizabeth, that adventurous seafaring spirit, which was destined eventually to plant the flag of England on the shores of every ocean, had come to birth, and everywhere it found, during this early part of the 17th century, Dutch rivals already in possession, and Dutch ships on every trading route. The Dutch mercantile marine, in fact, far exceeded the English in numbers and efficiency. The publication of Hugo Grotius' famous pamphlet Mare Liberum in March 1609 was probably the final cause which decided James to issue his Fisheries Proclamation. The purpose of Grotius was to claim for every nation, as against the Portuguese, freedom of trade in the Indian Ocean, but the arguments he used appeared to King James and his advisers to challenge the dominion maritime, which English kings had always claimed in the narrow seas. The embassy of 1610, therefore, had to deal not merely with the fisheries, but with the whole subject of the maritime relations of the two countries, and a crowd of published pamphlets proved the intense interest that was aroused. But the emergence of the dispute as to the Julius Cleves succession, and the change in the policy of the French government owing to the assassination of Henry IV, led both sides to desire an accommodation, and James consented, not indeed to withdraw the edict, but to postpone its execution for 2 years. It remained a dead letter until 1616, although all the time the wranglings over the legal aspects of the questions in dispute continued. The Republic, however, as an independent state, was very much hampered by the awkward fact of the cautionary towns remaining in English hands. The occupation of Flushing and Brill, commanding the entrances to important waterways, seemed to imply that the Dutch Republic was to a certain extent a vassal state under the protection of England. Alden Barnavelt resolved, therefore, to take advantage of King James's notorious financial embarrassments by offering to redeem the towns by a ready money payment. The nominal indebtedness of the United Provinces for loans advanced by Elizabeth was £600,000. The Advocate offered in settlement £100,000 in cash and £150,000 more in half-yearly payments. James accepted the offer, and the towns were handed over, the garrisons being allowed to pass into the Dutch service, June 1616. Sir Dudley Carleton, however, who about this time succeeded Sir Ralph Winwood as English envoy to the Hague, continued to have a seat in the Council of State. Alden Barnavelt thus, at a time when his dominant position in the state was already being undermined and his career drawing to an end, performed a great service to his country, the more so as King James, in his eagerness to negotiate a marriage between the Prince of Wales and a Spanish infanta, was beginning to allow his policy to be more and more controlled by the Count of Gondomar, the Spanish ambassador at Whitehall. James's leaning towards Spain naturally led him to regard with stronger disfavour the increasing prominence of the Dutch flag upon the seas, and it was not long before he was sorry that he had surrendered the cautionary towns. For the fishery rights and the principle of the dominion maritime in the narrow seas were no longer the only questions in dispute between England and the States. English seamen and traders had other grievances to allege against the Hollanders in other parts of the world. The exclusive right to fish for whales in the waters of Spitzbergen and Greenland was claimed by the English on the ground of Hugh Willoughby's alleged discovery of Spitzbergen in 1553. The Dutch would not admit any such claim, and asserted that Heemskerk was the first to visit the archipelago, and that he planted in 1596 the Dutch flag on the shores of the island, to which he gave the name of Spitzbergen. In 1613 James conferred the monopoly upon the English Muscovy Company, who sent out a fishing fleet with orders to drive off any interlopers, and certain Dutch vessels were attacked and plundered. The reply of the States General was the granting of a charter, January 27, 1614, to a company known as the Northern or Greenland Company, with the monopoly of fishing between Davis's Strait and Nova Zembla, and a fishing fleet was sent out accompanied by warships. The result was a temporary agreement between the English and Dutch companies for using separate parts of Spitzbergen as their bases, all others being excluded. Meanwhile the dispute was kept open, and despite conferences and negotiations neither side showed any disposition to yield. Matters reached an acute stage in 1618. English and Dutch fishing fleets of exceptional strength sailed into northern waters in the early summer of that year, and a fierce fight took place, which, as 2 Dutch war vessels were present, resulted in the scattering of the English vessels and considerable loss of life and property. The rivalry and opposition between the Dutch and English traders in the East Indies was on a larger scale, but here there was no question of the Dutch superiority in force, and it was used remorselessly. The Dutch East India Company had thriven apace. In 1606 a dividend of 50% had been paid, in 1609 one of 325%. The chief factory was at Bantam, but there were many others on the mainland of India, and at Amboina, Banda, Ternate and Maasjan in the Moluccas. And from these centres trade was carried on with Ceylon, with Borneo, and even with distant China and Japan. But the position of the company was precarious until the secret article of the Treaty of 1609 conceded liberty of trade during the truce. The chief need was to create a centre of administration, from which a general control could be exercised over all the officials at the various trading factories throughout the East Indian archipelago. It was resolved, therefore, by the Council of 17 to appoint a Director General, who should reside at Bantam, armed with powers which made him, far removed as he was from interference by the home authorities, almost a sovereign in the extensive region which he administered. Jan Pieterszoon Koen, appointed in 1614, was the first of a series of capable men by whose vigorous and sometimes unscrupulous action the Dutch company became rapidly the dominant power in the eastern seas, where their trade and influence overshadowed those of their European competitors. The most enterprising of those competitors were the English. Disputes quickly arose between the rival companies as to trading rights in the Moluccas, the Banda group and Amboina, and some islands where the English had made treaties with the natives were occupied by the Dutch and the English expelled. Another grievance was the refusal of the States General in 1616 to admit English dyed cloths into the United Provinces. This had caused especial irritation to King James. The manufacture of woolen cloth and the exportation of wool had for long been the chief of English industries, and the monopoly of the trade was, when James ascended the throne, in the hands of the oldest of English chartered companies, the Fellowship of Merchant Adventurers. The adventurers held since 1598 their court and staple at Middelburg in Zeeland. The English had not learnt the art of finishing and dyeing the cloth that they wove. It was imported in its unfinished state, and was then dyed and prepared for commerce by the Dutch. Some thousands of skilled hands found employment in Holland in this work. James, always impecunious, determined in 1608, on the proposal of a certain alderman Cockayne, to grant Cockayne a patent for the creation of a home dyeing industry, reserving to the crown a monopoly for the sale of the goods. The adventurers complained of this as a breach of their charter, and after much bickering the king in 1615 settled the dispute by withdrawing the charter. Cockayne now hoped that the company he had formed would be a profitable concern, but he and the king were doomed to disappointment. The Estates of Holland refused to admit the English dyed cloths, and their example was followed by the other provinces and by the States General. Cockayne became bankrupt, and in 1617 the king had to renew the charter of the adventurers. James was naturally very sore at this rebuff, and he resolved upon reprisals by enforcing the proclamation of 1609 and exacting a toll from all foreign vessels fishing in British waters. Great was the indignation in Holland, and the fishing fleet in 1617 set sail with an armed convoy. A Scottish official named Brown, who came to collect the toll, was seized and carried as a prisoner to Holland. James at once laid hands on 2 Dutch skippers in the Thames as hostages, and demanded satisfaction for the outrage upon his officer. Neither side would at first give way, and it was not until after some months that an accommodation was patched up. The general question of the fishery privileges remained, however, just as far from settlement as ever, for the States stood firm upon their treaty rights. At length it was resolved by the States to send a special mission to England to discuss with the king the 4 burning questions embittering the relations between the two countries. The envoys arrived in London, December 1618. For 7 months the parleyings went on without any definite result being reached, and in August 1619 the embassy returned. Very important events had meanwhile been occurring both in the United Provinces and in Germany, which made it necessary to both parties that the decision on these trade questions, important as they were, should be postponed for a while, as they were overshadowed by the serious political crisis in Holland and in Bohemia, which were then occupying all men's attention. End of chapter 8.